Hi everyone, just before you watch this particular episode of DEBO'S Den, I would love for you to actually subscribe to our YouTube page, and not just subscribe, to actually also hit the bell button to get notifications whenever new episodes of DEBO'S Den comes out. Thank you. Don't forget, hit the bell button. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of DEBO'S Den. I'm excited to present today's episode, and we're actually going to have a very interesting topic today. Today we're actually going to be talking about China. China is, it has this sort of mystery and mystique around it, and it's one of those countries that I think is actually very misunderstood. But then again, we'll go into that. Let me start off just by giving you a little bit about some of the physical characteristics that we kind of like already know about China. And then we'll take a deep dive into some of the things that I don't think you know about China, but I'll be able to share based on my experience. So China, in terms of the characteristics that we all know, it is the world's second largest economy after the United States. It is the world's largest country by population with 1.4 billion people. Now, if you think about it, and from an African perspective, Africa's population is about 1.4 billion, and these 1.4 billion people are spread out over 54, 55 countries. And so I'm smiling because I'm thinking that I have heard Africa being referred to as a country. It is not one country, it is 54, 55 different countries, but at the end of the day, in terms of population, China has 1.4 billion people, which is also the estimate in terms of the number of people living on the African continent. So back to China. China is important. There's several things about China. Second biggest economy in the world, as I've already mentioned, largest population in the world, third largest country by land mass. China borders 14 countries, which is, I think, the largest or the second largest in terms of number of countries that border a single one. And so China has a lot of things going for it. China is also very misunderstood because there are lots of things that happen in China that usually is reported differently, and those who live in China see things differently from maybe those who live outside of China. China, as you also know, in terms of its political system, runs a kind of like communist, capitalistic kind of economy, which is slightly different from the largest economy in the world, the US, which runs a democracy, capitalistic kind of economy. So it's different. And so in many ways, China has become the opposite of the US, but it's been able to kind of like develop its own economy and how it functions very differently from the US. So today, again, we're exploring China. And so I'll go into a little bit of detail about what we'll be discussing about China. So we'll be right back. This first section, we're going to talk about doing business successfully in China and some of the tips that I can share with you. But before then, let me give you a backstory. In 2015, about 6-7 years ago, my family and I decided to move to China. At the time, my spouse got a job in China. She worked in a multinational firm, and she got a job in China, and having discussed as a family, we decided, hey, this might just be a new adventure. So there we go, 2015, and the plan was to spend a year or two in China and come back to our home country. But what happened was I ended up spending 6 years in China. So based on spending all of that time in China and all, I've got a lot of experiences to share, believe me. I loved living in China, particularly in Shanghai. I primarily lived in two cities, one for about 1 year and the other for about 5 years. So I lived in a city in China called Yiwu. It's spelled Y-I-W-U. Yiwu, if you pronounce it with English, but I think maybe I like to say I am a bendi, which means a local. So I started pronouncing it in the right way, Yiwu. Thereafter moved to Shanghai and lived in Shanghai for about 5 years, as I said. So China was lovely. I had lovely experiences, made lots of friends, had a lot of people from various international places, multiple countries. So I love the fact that when I was in Shanghai, I could, literally pop into a supermarket or a bar or something, and you're talking to people and you're asking, where are you from? Where are you from? And they would have different nationalities and different, races and all. Sometimes on Sundays when I would go to the church that I attended in China, we could have as many as 50 different countries represented in a particular church session or church event. And not just church, but even in other activities, there was always this amount of diversity, particularly in Shanghai, and I know this happened in many other cities. So I have a lot of fun memories of China, but at the same time, being a business person, being African, in 2018, I set about, after 3 years of living there, I set about writing a report, and I wouldn't say a book, but a kind of like market report on doing business successfully. That report ended up being expanded, and I even have and I ended up updating it in 2019, in 2020, and probably would update it for a 2022 version, maybe based on this demand. So if it's something that you're interested in, hey, feel free to reach out to me and on DEBO'S Den. So basically, I have lived in China, I have experienced China, I have seen the good in China, I have seen the bad in China, and maybe even the ugly in China. And so having said all of this, there are a few things that from my reports that I have been keeping, my business dealings, the opportunities that I have seen there, that I'd love to share with all of you listening to me today. Now, the beauty is, on the one hand, China is not a country that you can ignore business-wise. China has a population, I mentioned earlier, of 1.4 billion. Now, not only does it have a large population, China successfully, within a 20-year period, moved over 400 million people from low poverty into middle-class citizens. Now, this is impossible to ignore, and this explains why many multinational firms, luxury firms, banks, and all that from the US, from Europe, from wherever, are actually always trying to enter into China. Now, for African companies and African startups, what I'm going to be sharing today will be some of the tips that you should remember if you want to expand into China. And it's a huge market, and I see no reason why people shouldn't be targeting China. And who best to share some of this knowledge with you than an African entrepreneur who has actually lived in China? So stay tuned, and I'm going to keep talking about the tips that I have. My very first tip on doing business in China for African startups is recognize the demography and the economy that you want to target vis-a-vis your product. Now, one mistake many people make is to think of China oh, it's 1.4 billion people. It's this very big country. How do I actually even enter it? The reality is that yes, politically, and even, demography wise, China is one country. But economically, think of each province as a different country. Now, Shanghai, one of the places I lived in, had a population of about 25 million people. So just Shanghai alone, that province, had 25 million people. Then you then had other provinces that had, 10 million, 20 million, 30 million. Remember that 30 million, 40 million, 50 million people is the size of certain countries. For example, the UK has a population of about 50, 60 million, which is the same as France, and similar population as Germany. The US does have 300 million people, but even then, it's kind of like split and spliced. Now, why I say this is that in terms of your product, it might be better for you to target maybe one of the provinces, depending on what it is that you sell. So rather than trying to enter China and enter literally through all the popular places, you could actually enter China through one of the quote unquote smaller places, noting that a smaller place could have a population of 50 million. Okay? Let me give you an example. In China, and this is just something that is very interesting, a stat that I have shared in the past with other people. In China, as at the last count, they had 120 cities with a population of 1 million and above. What this means is that not only can you target your product on a province by province basis, you literally can also target your product on a city by city basis. And the needs of these cities are diverse. And so literally, if you're an African startup, the first tip I would give you is to do your research on what product you sell and what province or city to actually target in China. So that leads me to tip 2 on doing business in China, which is that make sure you are aware of the legal and operating requirements of your industry and what you're doing. Now, let me state this. I don't know what country you're going to be watching this from, but China does not play with its taxes. So in whatever it is that you're doing, make sure you do your research on the effect of the FAPIAO. So you might hear this word several times. FAPIAO is FAPIAO. And essentially, it's kind of like the withholding tax or VAT system in China on top of all goods and services that are traded or services purchased in China. Why is this important? Because if maybe in the product that you offer, your margin is 10%, and maybe the FAPIAO is 5 or 10%, it means that you just need to make sure that you have made necessary arrangements for the taxes that need to be paid or even deducted on the products that you're selling in that particular country. Now, this is important because, again, as I said, China does not play with their taxes, but it's also important for you to understand that tax system. Now, in addition to that, still talking legal and regulatory operations, it's also important for you to understand whether you want to partner with another Chinese firm or whether you want to register your own local Chinese firm that will work with others. I'm going to expand on this particular point a little bit. So hold on for the next point. So this point is on knowing the right structure or the right vehicle to use to operate in China. Now, in China, there are primarily 3 vehicles of having your operations in the market. There is a joint venture option. You have the option of having what we call a representative office, and then you have something that China started doing about a decade ago or so. We can check that, called a WOFE, or a wholly owned foreign enterprise. So WOFE, WOFE, wholly owned foreign enterprise. Prior to a decade ago or 20 years ago or so, if you wanted to operate in China, you needed to have a joint venture with a Chinese firm. And so that way you have a partnership with a Chinese firm, and then you then set up a company to then operate in China. And gradually China started opening up, updating their regulations and things like that. And then they then had what they call a WOFE, as I mentioned, and it's wholly owned foreign enterprise. And as the name implies, it means that you can set up a company in China that you wholly own. So 100% foreign ownership of companies is actually allowed in China. Now, this is actually important, and it's funny what I'm about to say. Even for many foreign entities living in China, and I met many people who had lived in China way before I arrived, many of them, for some reason, don't actually even know that they can form their own entities without having a joint venture with a Chinese firm. And so important for you to note what a WOFE is, and please check who you're receiving advice from. The beauty of a WOFE is that it's 100% owned by whoever it is, and you can use that WOFE for even joint ventures with other Chinese firms and all. But I think it's important that if you're going to, and this is my recommendation, if you're going to do business in China, register a WOFE such that you can then use that WOFE to, if you're importing, to import the items that you want to into China, or to even partner with other Chinese firms. Again, you can also use this for the services that you want to sell and things like that. Note, don't forget some of the other things that I mentioned. It's important for you to know what province that you're targeting. And it's also important for you to understand the regulatory framework, particularly in terms of taxes. So that's one tip for you. Don't forget that. You want to choose a location of where to set up in China, or where to actually target in China. It depends on what it is that you're doing. The reality is that as big as China is, it actually also has clusters. And this is one of the things that, really works well in China. There are some cities that, if you're in the furniture industry, those are the kind of cities that you should target. So for example, Dongyuan is one of those, for example, if you're in the furniture business or have things that have to do with wood. If you're in the services sector, for example, and have things that relate to hardware manufacturing and stuff like that, then Shenzhen, or Shenzhen, as some people pronounce it, Shenzhen, is actually one of those clusters where you can actually have things done. If you're in the fitness industry, with fitness apps or technology related to that, a city like in Jiangsu, Suzhou, is one of those places that you can actually target. If you are in the education industry, edtech industry, there are also other clusters as well, like in Shanghai. It's one of those cities. If you're in the technology space, in the hub space, you have Shanghai, Beijing, as cities that you can do things in. If you're in the fashion slash textile industry, a Wenzhou is one of those cities that you can target. So what am I saying? Depending on the kind of business that you do, there are different clusters. If you're in the fintech industry, Shanghai is probably one of your best bet, because that's even where you have the likes of Ant Financial, Union 54, and several other companies like that. In China, there are many companies that are able to leverage scale. And so if you're going to do business in China, look for the hubs, and then those hubs will help you identify the right places to actually do business in. Just by the way, Get Funded Africa is actually going to release the updated version of our Doing Business in China report. And so if this is something that you're interested in, a few weeks from now when it's ready, you could literally just send us an email that you're interested in this report, and when it's ready we'll send you an email and you can actually see where to purchase this. So on to the next tip. One of the other things I get asked about, and I'll share this tip, is actually on visiting China and running a business in China, especially even having a team in China. So if you're going to have people in China moving from maybe Africa to China, or you as a founder want to be able to shuttle between China and Africa, there are questions around visas. So visas for visiting, visas for having your own team there, and even hiring, there are loads of questions around that. So my tip is simple. If you're the founder, then China is happy to issue, will I say, for easy way of calling it is startup visas. And so they're actually able to offer visas to startup founders for extended periods of time. Because they're all, like all companies and all countries, they're willing to have people come into the country to invest into the country. But note, if in China you're given a visa and the basis of the visa is that, you will invest X amount of money or even hire X amount of people within China, they would ask you that down the line. Maybe 1 year later, 2 years later, they would actually ask for information regarding that. So just note that if you're going to have a company in China and have a team in China to help with your expansion into China, whatever province that is, keep in mind that it's always a good idea, and there's no law in this really, but it's always a good idea to at least hire some staff in China. And when you're bringing in your own team as well, have the right relationships with the relevant city or government and all. There's something in China called guanxi, and guanxi is, it kind of like means relationships. So in China, as with many other developing countries, guanxi is important, and guanxi or relationships, in some countries like Nigeria, they say who you know, which is really more like who do you know and what relationships have you formed. So one person can meet person A and it's a no, and the same person meets, or person B meets that same person and it's a yes. So sometimes relationships actually do matter in getting things done. That's another tip, and I hope you find this useful. Now, how do you market your goods and services in China? Interesting question, and it's a very good one. Now, in other places, one of the things that you're able to do is to maybe leverage Google for, online ads and things like that. In China, however, note something. Google does not work. Facebook does not work. Instagram does not work. WhatsApp, I wouldn't say it does not work, but it works sparingly, if I can use that word. Microsoft works to an extent, right? But the thing is, in China, they believe that they've been able to create their own versions of all of these things. And so they actually, it's not like they miss all these things. They don't. In reality, even if they allowed Google and all these things to work, there will be second tier companies in terms of the market, because the Chinese companies have been able to adapt to the market and have grown very, very large and will outcompete anybody. just a good example in this particular case is Uber essentially came into China, and to be fair, Uber actually did well, and they had good services. And I remember that they were one of the first companies in China to offer the services in English. What it did do was that it also spurred competition from another Chinese app, another ride-hailing Chinese app called Didi. And eventually what happened in China was that Didi purchased Uber, and Uber essentially left the market for Didi. Now, I say this because there are lots of companies that are willing to compete locally. So going back to the original point, or this tip that I was making, in terms of how do you actually advertise in China, the reality is that you're going to have to leverage two specific things. One is what they call key opinion leaders, or in other countries or in other climes, they'll say influencers. And two is leveraging some platforms such as WeChat, and other platforms like that. I mentioned WeChat because it's probably one of the most popular platforms in China. Think of Facebook, WhatsApp, and maybe a few other services combined into one app, and one super app at that, which also includes payments and things like that. So that's how powerful WeChat is. Now, WeChat gives the option of WeChat pages where you can actually create your own content. So for a small business trying to sell in China, if it is a service or a product, you can actually leverage WeChat, as I mentioned. And then in addition to WeChat, there's Weibo, which is like a micro blogging site. Think of it as a Reddit. If it's a product, one of the major ways of marketing your product is going to be Taobao. Let me talk briefly about Taobao. Taobao is actually owned by Alipay. And so many people globally talk about Alibaba website, which is the wholesale website. And then there's AliExpress, which is kind of like the retail website of the Alibaba group. Now, within China, there is no Alibaba website because they're selling from China, right? And there is no AliExpress because it's dollar denominated. Within China, the e-commerce site, the biggest e-commerce site, is actually run by the Alibaba group and is known as Taobao. And Taobao essentially is a way to actually put your product in front of millions of people. And so Taobao works across literally every village, every province, and across the country in China. That's one way to market a product. For services, you have different platforms depending on the type of service that you offer. So it could be an app on fitness, and there are several fitness apps that you can use, and you can use those apps in conjunction with key opinion leaders or influencers, like I said. And so again, if you think about it from an African startup's perspective, it's more of find the right city that you want to promote to, and that forms your early entry into that city. And then two, find out which hub that city actually falls into, again, related to your product. Make sure that you understand the taxation system. Ensure that, you know, as I said, I recommend you do a WOFE, a wholly owned foreign enterprise. Ensure that you have the right venture or the right legal structure to actually sell and receive money, and that you also can you can get your FAPIAO based on those things that you do. And I know that some of these terms and terminology would take some learning, but then again, that's why it's important to do your research, have discussions with people that can help. And just by the way, at Get Funded Africa, one of the things that we do is actually help companies to scale and to grow. So again, please feel free to reach out to the DEBO'S Den email, and we'll be happy to across to some of the relevant team members. Thank you so much for listening, and hope you now know a bit more about China, and happy to discuss this as well as your questions in the comments. Like this particular page, subscribe for our page, and also hit the bell button such that whenever we release new editions of DEBO'S Den, you'd be notified. We really would appreciate this because that's how we can actually keep this story going. So again, subscribe, hit the bell button so that you're notified whenever a new episode of DEBO'S Den comes in. Thank you so much for your support. That's all for now. Bye, folks.